we go. All right. So this session is called Advising on Chapter Finances. And I am Deirdra DiVittis. I'm presenting the Region H Finance Chair. For this presentation, I want to talk about a little bit of my background and establish some credibility as to how I'm a good source for this info. And then I'm going to go through some Chapter Treasurer 101 because I think this has come up quite a bit over this morning and yesterday. It's important for advisors to understand what the students' officers' roles are supposed to be, and then kind of go over some tax compliance stuff. Some of that might be things you haven't heard of before, and then advisor responsibilities, what the officer guide actually says advisors are supposed to do, and some additional things that advisors can help with, and then also share some tools and resources. This isn't going to be super like a lot of opportunity for participation, but if you have a question, you can share in the chat or like raise your hand in the chat, and hopefully I'll figure out what's going on. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm the Region H Finance Chair. I've only held this position for like 2 months now. I have a dual degree in accounting and business management. I graduated from Carlow University in 2017, and Carlow is in Pittsburgh. I moved to Columbus immediately after graduating. My APO story, I pledged in fall 2013. And I served in a bunch of different leadership positions. I was chapter historian, VP of leadership, chapter president, a section conference chair, and I was also on, I was the Region 5 delegate for the Chapter Finance and Operations Reference Committee at 2016 National Convention. So it was a really cool experience. I never actually served as a chapter treasurer in APO, but I did serve as treasurers for other student organizations. I was in a bunch of different clubs in college. And I was also the Student Government Association treasurer, so I had a pretty good grasp on student organization budgets. My professional background is in accounts payable and public accounting. I've done just about everything: outsourced bookkeeping and accounting, some federal tax stuff, audit and assurance, and state and local tax and business licensing. Right now, I work in an indirect tax firm where I'm mostly doing sales and use tax and business license, compliance, and consulting work. The types of companies I've worked with range from small sole proprietors where there's like one guy and maybe 2 employees, to mid-sized companies, nonprofits, and also large publicly traded corporations that make billions of dollars and have 40 different companies in their corporate group. So I have a pretty wide range of experience in all things tax, finance, and accounting. So to start the presentation, I want to go through Chapter Treasurer 101. So what does a chapter treasurer do? According to the National Office's Treasurer Officer Guide, there's 5 essential job functions. So one is to develop a chapter budget and track chapter funding and expenditures. Also maintaining financial transparency by having the advisory chair and at least 2 officers with access to the chapter's bank account. So that just means that the treasurer isn't the only person that can access the chapter's funds. They're also responsible for collecting dues and other fees from students and to pay dues and other invoices through the officer portal to the national office in a timely manner. They're also responsible for maintaining good standing with the IRS, and also responsible for tracking and collecting chapter dues from members to deposit into the chapter's account. So that's pretty straightforward. I don't think there's any big surprises there. I thought this was kind of cool. In the officer guide, there's this little graphic I stole on some traits of being a successful treasurer. So I pulled this out because I was thinking, here are some things that, advisors don't have any input into what students get elected to what positions. But if you notice that a student has been elected into the treasurer position and they need some more guidance in some of these areas, that's a really good way for an advisor to step in and say, hey, you know, I noticed you can maybe be a little bit more organized. Let me help you with that and provide some guidance. So these are just some, again, I think this is pretty straightforward. The kind of the big thing though with these chapter budgets is every chapter in Alpha Phi Omega is on a different campus, and every university campus has a different way of doing things. So I kind of broke out the way chapter budgets are structured into 3 different categories and how this impacts any tax and like state and local government compliance that they have to deal with. So the first one is the chapter has its own tax ID number in the US, the federal level, it's the FEIN, which is Federal Employer ID number through the IRS. So when the chapter has its own FEIN, they typically have their own bank accounts and manage their own budget independently of the university. They also are responsible for filing their own 990 to the IRS, and also any other tax filing requirements that there might be. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. The second one is the chapter is rolled into the university budget. So the chapter does not maintain its own bank account. It doesn't, its budget is overseen by the university as well. And the chapter does not have its own tax ID number. My alma mater, Carlo, for a student organization to be recognized by the university, they have to be rolled into the university budget and FEIN. So my chapter, my home chapter, was under this structure. The hybrid budget is, you know, maybe the chapter is rolled into the university's tax ID number, but maybe the chapter has its own bank accounts, and maybe sometimes it receives money from the university. So you can kind of have a mix depending on what school their chapter's at. So it's something to be aware of. And if you're new to a chapter and you're advising on anything chapter finances, this should be the first question you ask is, do you have an FEIN? Do you file your own 990? Do you have your own bank accounts? Do you get any money from the university? Do you go through a budgeting process through the university? If you don't know the answers to those questions, you can't really advise on anything else chapter finance related. So I put together like step-by-step what a chapter treasurer should do when building a budget. And this is kind of based on all of my experience with student organizations from college. So the first thing, the chapter treasurer should consult with officers and committee chairs to figure out what their plans are. So if the service chair knows we're going to need these materials for service events, and you know the recruitment chair knows we want to do these recruitment events, the chapter treasurer needs to know about those things so that they can build a budget. The treasurer should also consult with the membership VP or membership committee on any anticipated membership and pledge class numbers for the next year. So we've talked about membership quite a bit this weekend, and it's important to budgeting too. You need to know what to anticipate your dues as, especially if the chapter is collecting dues on top of the national dues for the chapter to use. You can't budget your expenses without knowing what funds you have available to use. And then, you know, building the budget based on the anticipated revenue and expenses. The treasurer should always present the budget to the chapter, and the chapter should vote on it. If that's not happening, that's a big problem. And then this kind of goes back to that graphic I pulled in earlier from the officer guide. One of the traits of being a chapter treasurer is being transparent. It's incredibly important that the members know what their funds are being spent on, because a lot of chapters utilize dues as a fundraising for the chapter. And even if, you know, your chapter gets all of its money from the university, like my alma mater does, our student fees go into that. So it's incredibly important for the chapter to be aware, even if they don't hold any leadership positions in the chapter, they need to be aware what the budget has included in it. And then that also kind of gives you puts everybody on the same page of what to expect for the next year. Typically student org budgets go in a, annual sort of process, but some chapters might do something different too. So that's something to be aware of. And then the last step, if a chapter budget is rolled into a university budget, then the treasurer should be spearheading any process they have to go through. Maybe it's a student government association or student activities board. My alma mater, the student organizations had to present their budgets to the student government association, and then the student government would vote on it. And those were public meetings that any student could attend. So that's the process I'm familiar with, but I'm very much aware that other schools do things very differently. So, so something to be aware of. And I threw this in here. This is a schedule of fees for the national office. I think this is handy to have. It's pretty easy to project, like multiply the number of pledges and returning members that you have by each of these fees to figure out what amount of money you have to collect. Something to note is that, these monies maybe aren't included in the budget because the chapter isn't spending them, they're collecting it and then handing it straight off to the national office. But they should be included in your gross receipts calculation for the 990 because it is money that was collected by the chapter. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Some budgeting tips that I have. Treasurers should request specific information on planned expenditures from officers and committee chairs. So it's not just like, oh, we're going to have a taco night for fellowship. Well, how many brothers are planning on, how many brothers do you expect to attend that event? And how much does it cost to buy everything that you need for that taco night? Are you going to rent a movie? Do you need to have funds for Redbox or something like that? How much ground beef do you have to buy? How many taco shells do you need? How much cheese and salsa and other toppings, paper plates, all of that stuff should be included into that event cost. And it's a really good exercise for planning. And I think, student organizations don't always go that nitty gritty into detail, but they should. And if you don't know what something costs, research it. It's so easy to just, go on the internet, go on Amazon, Office Max, whatever it is, and figure out how much it costs to buy a big thing of paper plates. And something you might find is by doing that, you could buy more things at once in bulk that are going to be supplies for multiple events, and you might be able to save some money doing that. So that's something to be aware of. And then getting quotes for event catering and venues. I know my alma mater, most of our events were on campus, especially ceremonies and fellowship events. So if we were doing any catering or venue research, like it was all on campus, but even if it's not, you can still go, to the hotel that you have your banquet in or whatever event venue and say, hey, we would like to get quotes for catering this event next year. A lot of event venues need to plan out pretty far in advance anyways. So this kind of gets everybody on the same page. And also paying attention to fluctuations in price. Something I noticed when I was student government treasurer is we had a couple organizations that hadn't updated their catering prices in like a decade. They'd been the exact same for years. And we went back years and years and years, where are these numbers coming from? Because they were including numbers in their budget. And every year they do their budget and they're like, okay, we're still going to do that event again. And so we're just going to make it all the same in the budget for that event because it's the same event. Well, your membership doubled in those 10 years. So now you have more catering, now you have more tables you have to rent, and the cost of that event goes up, and that's why you're running out of money and you don't know why, because you're not paying attention to, an increase in what it's going to cost to do that same event next year. And that kind of brings me to my next point. Throughout the semester and throughout the year, the treasurer should be doing budget versus actual comparisons for their current year. So what does that mean? Well, we budgeted that we were going to spend $500 on this event. What did we actually spend? Okay, we spent $600 on this event, but we had another event that we spent way less, so it balances out. Paying attention to those things and making note of it makes budgeting for next year even easier. And you also want to consider, are there any large events that we're going to do differently next year? So maybe there's a special event that you do that juniors and seniors get invited to, and your chapter membership is growing and you're like, well, maybe we should only do seniors next year. Or maybe you want to include more people in the chapter. That's all kind of things to think about and consider. And part of that budget versus actual comparison is to continue to maintain transparency with the chapter. And that can be part of the treasurer's report during chapter meetings, is saying, hey, you know, we just had this big event that we do every year, you know, our youth service week event we did. And here's what we budgeted, here's what we actually spent. You know, we over budgeted by this amount, or we under budgeted by this amount, or we did really good. If you under budgeted, it's an opportunity to reallocate those funds to a different type of expense. And that's something that the chapter should be aware of and get to voice their thoughts on as well. So maybe, you know, if you end up with a large chunk of change that you didn't expect left over, spend it, especially if that money is coming from the university and it's a situation where maybe you don't get that money, you don't get to keep that money. And a lot of times that is the case with university managed budgets. You know, find an opportunity to use that, and what better opportunity than asking the chapter what they want to do with it. The last thing, make sure that, you know, the accounts that the chapter owns are being reconciled on a regular basis. So this could be checking accounts. I don't know that we would really have credit accounts for any of our chapters, but if we do, they should be reconciled. And that's part of this like budget versus actual comparison as well, is, you know, reconciling the difference between what we actually budgeted, or what we actually spent, and what we had budgeted for. So, and a bank reconciliation is just looking through the bank statement and looking through what your records show you spent and comparing them. So do you have receipts for every expense? For every check that went out, do you know what it's for? For every amount of money that came in, do you know what it's for? And that's really all a bank reconciliation is. So I found this Benjamin Franklin quote, and I thought this was really good point to make when talking about budgets and all these little pieces of the budget. Beware of little expenses. A small leak will sink a great ship. So think about like a big chapter like Alpha Iota at OSU. They have so many members, and if they just didn't think about their expenses with like paper plates and plasticware and napkins and things like that, like pens, for an entire year, how much money would that cause a gap in the budget? That can get pretty large pretty quickly. So it's just something to keep in mind. Also, IRS 990 reporting. I know this is like a huge stressful thing. And a lot of times, especially for college students, they hear the IRS and they hear tax forms and they start to panic. And that's how a lot of adults are too. So this really isn't that complicated. The IRS 990 form has a $5,000 or $50,000 annual gross receipts exemption threshold. So what does that mean? Well, gross receipts are any amount of money the chapter took in. So this could be dues, it could be fundraising, it could be, we bought chapter t-shirts and we collected money from the brothers in the chapter to purchase the t-shirts. You know, nonprofit organizations don't really have income. but gross receipts is any amount of money that they collect. So if you have coffee cans around campus and you're collecting pennies for something, for a fundraiser, all of those pennies that you collect should be included in your gross receipts calculation. There shouldn't be a single thing, a single piece of money that the chapter touches that's not included in that average gross receipts number. If you get any grants, or if you have an alumni endowment or trust of some kind and you're earning interest on that, like all of that, everything that the chapter gains is considered their gross receipts. And I think that that's a really confusing point for a lot of students, especially, but it's really not that hard. If the chapter handled the money, it should be included in their gross receipts. The other thing is that 50,000 threshold is based on an average of the last 3 years. So for the 2020 tax year, that IRS 990 form, you should be looking at 2020, 2019, and 2018, averaging your gross receipts for those 3 years. If you're under the 50,000 threshold, great, you can file the postcard IRS 990N form, super easy. If you're over the 50,000 threshold, now you have to file the long form. So I think a lot of people think this makes it more complicated, but what it does is it means that organizations, it kind of stabilizes their process. So if you have a year that, I don't know, you have an alumni that wins the lottery and gives the chapter $100,000, and typically the chapter is around $30,000 for gross receipts every year, they're not going to hit that $100,000 again next year, probably. And that's just like because of some one-off thing that happened. That IRS regulation is there to protect the organization from having to go through all this process to get this tax form filed when they're never going to have to do it again. On the flip side, if you are in the process and routine of filing the long IRS 990 form every year, and you have 1 year that you only had 48,000 in gross receipts, it still stabilizes that process so that you can do the same thing that you did last year. So I think it makes things less complicated and easier, but I'm a tax person. The longer form, I can show you what it looks like. If you've ever seen an IRS 990N, they're really short and it's like a couple check boxes. The IRS 990 long form is long. It asks a bunch of questions and you have to report specific financial data. There's a huge checklist you have to go through, and this checklist is something that changes periodically. I think last year there were some pretty big changes made to it. So, and it's just like some of these key questions, they're changing the question so that a yes answer on the old question would now be a no question or no answer. So it is really important if you're filling these out to read them every year, even if it looks like it's asking the same question. And there's a lot of questions. Yeah, you have to report a lot of information on here. So the goal is to pay attention to what your gross receipts are. And if you are close to that 50,000 threshold, start to plan for, are we going to be able to fill this out completely and accurately if we have to, when we have to. Because the 990N postcard is like a couple of questions. Like it's like a checkbox of, did your organization collect less than $50,000 gross receipts for the last calendar year? And you check yes. Like that's as complicated as the 990N gets. Way simplified compared to the full 990 form. And alongside that, most student organization budgets that I've seen, they don't report down to the detail or the types of transactions categorized as they are on the 990 form. So you can't just like take your chapter budget and go, we were pretty close to our budget, and use that to fill out the 990 form. That's a really bad idea. And you don't want to end up in a situation where the IRS randomly picks you for an audit and they're like, oh, this is not right. So if you are in a chapter, or if you advise or work with a chapter that is close to that threshold, get them out of Excel. Chapter budgets in Excel work really great whenever you have a very small amount of money that you're working with. Last fall, I started working with Alpha Iota at OSU and helping their chapter treasurer and finance committee implement QuickBooks in their chapter because they were using Google Sheets beforehand. And it was like way too cumbersome to use Google Sheets for their budget with how big their budget is and how many members they have. And just things that should be really easy, like tracking dues, was entirely overcomplicated through that process. So we implemented QuickBooks, and now if they get to that 3-year average of 50,000, which I think they're around 40,000+ now. So whenever they do hit 50K, we'll be ready and we'll be able to just pull data out of QuickBooks to file those forms, and it'll be super easy. So if you do have a chapter that you're working with as an advisor or in your section, a conversation to consider having with them is what are they doing to record their financial information, and if they're in Excel or Google Sheets, we need to figure out a better solution. I do have a background as being a QuickBooks Pro Advisor. My certification expired, but I still work in it quite a bit. And a few weeks ago, actually, I did a webinar on QuickBooks for APO, which is available on the Region H website. So I highly recommend checking that out if you think maybe you have a chapter that should be using QuickBooks or something like that. There are other softwares available. QuickBooks is, in my opinion, the best, and QuickBooks Online is the perfect answer for APO chapters that are concerned about 990 reporting. So that's my spiel about IRS 990s. There are some other tax implications. You'd think nonprofits don't pay tax, right? So they shouldn't have to deal with it, but that's not true. There are some other forms and things that APO chapters might have to deal with in addition to the IRS 990s. So in Ohio, one thing that we have, the Attorney General has a charitable registration annual report that nonprofits have to file every year. It's super simple. And the students at Alpha Iota have no trouble with it. I'd be surprised if anybody has trouble with it as long as they know where to go to file it. There are, in other states, there are Secretary of State requirements for nonprofits that an AFIO chapter would fit into those definitions of having to file. I know Texas franchise tax is one that there are APO chapters registered with. So that's something to consider. Just because you're registered for a tax type does not mean that you're paying taxes. It could mean that you're filing a tax form and reporting zero tax due. So that's another kind of thing that confuses people. If you're a wholesaler of goods in Ohio and you're making sales and those sales are for resale, so you're not collecting any sales tax, you still have to be registered with a sales tax account with the state of Ohio. And that form, you just report zero tax due every time you file it. So same thing goes for nonprofits. A lot of times there's these other registrations we have to do that we forget about. And I know Texas franchise tax doesn't have anything to do with our region for the most part, but I knew that example and I wanted to throw it in there. There's also local business licenses at the city or county level that you may need to be registered for. I don't have any examples off the top of my head that I know for sure would impact AFIO chapters, but that is something to consider and something to be aware of, especially if you're advising a new chapter that you haven't advised before. I'm not super familiar with Indiana. Kentucky does have a lot of local business licenses. There's a lot of localities in Kentucky that have business licenses, but the ones that I've worked with are tied to income tax filings. So I'm not super well versed in those either, but just be aware that you could run into that. So if you hear a chapter say, oh, we have to file this tax form, they might be right, even though, you know, nonprofits don't pay tax. There's also some sales and use tax stuff to think about. And, you know, in Ohio, this process is really easy. Sorry, my cat just made some noise in the closet. Ohio makes this process really easy of like proving that you don't have to pay sales tax on transactions. Other states are a little bit more complicated. Illinois is a pain in the neck. And so California can kind of be too. So just, you know, kind of be aware of that. Just because, you know, we're a nonprofit doesn't mean that you'll never have to file a tax form. And when in doubt, do research. And I love doing research on stuff. So if you have, you know, ever have a situation where you're like, I don't know, like this chapter's filing this form and I kind of don't think they need to, or if you're a section chair and you see two chapters that are kind of close to each other in the same state, and one's filing one type of form and the other isn't, that's a time to ask questions. All right, so now we've talked about the chapter treasurer responsibilities. I'm going to move more into the advisor responsibilities. These come straight from the treasurer office guide and are mostly geared towards the advisory chair, but other advisors could do this as well. They need to maintain access to chapter bank accounts. So if you're the advisory chair, you should have some type of access to that bank account. You should have the bank account numbers, the routing numbers, probably a password and login credentials to view the bank on the banking, online banking stuff. Any chapter taxes that are filed, so Ohio Attorney General registrations and IRS 990 receipts, chapter advisory chairs should have access to that. They should provide some input during budgeting process, but more as, you know, guidance as needed. And then a big one is participating in financial review of chapter financial activities. And then campus and faculty advisors should be assisting with any funding received through the university. I don't know if that one's actually in the officer guide, but it is something that those advisors should be doing. So in addition to those things, what can advisors do? Advisement on best practices is a great thing that advisors can do, and why it's important for advisors to understand what each student officer should be doing. Advisement on best practices for documenting and storing financial records is so important and incredibly crucial whenever it comes time to do officer transition, especially if the outgoing officer leaves suddenly without expecting it. You know, when I was chapter president, I was the vice president of leadership, and it was halfway through a term. Our president, her twin sister was in a really bad accident, like car accident, and she had to like basically stop doing everything outside of going to class to like help take care of her sister. And so she stepped down as chapter president, and I think she was just like an associate member or something. And then our VP of service moved to a different state suddenly within a couple weeks of that. And I was like the next in command, kind of like what's going on. And we made it through that because we had documented everything digitally in ways that were easy to access. And if we didn't have that like shared Google Drive, we would not have made it through that time. So definitely a really strong thing that advisors can help with that has a huge impact. Advisors can also assist with grant applications, including helping to find grants. So the APO National Office has grants that student chapters can apply for, and Brittany talked about that in the last session, like the youth service grant, service innovation, but there's nothing stopping chapters from getting grants outside of APO too. If there's something specific the chapter wants to do that they need to raise funds for, don't be afraid to look at that. I included some websites here, grantwatch.com and foundationcenter.org, that are like, you can just search for grants. So that is something advisors can help with. And then also helping to connect student leaders with resources, because that's why we're here, right? And then here's a tip I have. If the advisors are not confident in conducting any kind of financial review on chapters activities, they can pull in somebody else. You could get a campus administrator or faculty member is probably the next best person to the advisors to do that financial review, and it will be even more independent, you know? So people you can look for to do that are, you know, you could go straight to the, you know, campus accounting department, or the accounting faculty or business faculty. That might be a good place to start. They might be super into that. You might be able to find like a student or a grad student that would be interested in that as well. So just something to kind of keep in mind if, you know, if the chapter advisory chair needs assistance, that's a great resource that we all have, right? And then I threw this in. This was, I know this is like, says freshly married and it's something about marriage, but I think it applies to APO too. Sometimes it's not about the money, but rather the process of managing money. So what I'm trying to get at here is don't let the budget and financial management stress you out. Don't let it stress the students out. And the money itself isn't the cause of the stress, it's the managing it. So if we can just build good processes for managing the money, I think we'll all be okay, right? And then I'm going to wrap up with some tools and resources that are available. So the one that everybody knows about is Excel and Google Sheets, which are great for simple budgets. You can link multiple sheets in an Excel file or on Google Sheets to each other. So you could have each committee has a budget and then that filters into the chapter budget. And you could set up some pretty cool kind of automated things there. If a chapter is receiving university funds, they're probably going to be required to use a specific budget form for getting those funds, but it doesn't mean that the chapter has to use that for their whole budget if they have funds coming from somewhere else. So that's, you know, something that I did in student government was our student government budget. Like we had, you know, the university form that we had to fill out, and it was more supposed to be like top level kind of stuff. So we had our own spreadsheets that were super specific and detailed that had all of that detail that we put together to hold separately, that didn't go into the big budget presentation that got voted on for like the student body. So, you know, you don't have to use, like, restrict yourself to those forms if they don't really work for you. You know, obviously use them to get the money from the university, but you don't need to use it for your whole budget. There's also accounting and bookkeeping software like QuickBooks that I've talked about. And my QuickBooks webinar is linked on the Region H site, so you can go log on and watch it whenever you want. My warning is to not try to implement an accounting software like QuickBooks without someone who's a professional in that field assisting you. And I'm throwing myself out there as available and willing to help chapters, even outside of Region H, implementing QuickBooks if they're interested in that. QuickBooks does cost money. I think OSU's QuickBooks subscription for QuickBooks Online is like $40 a month. So for the bigger chapters, it's not bad. For the smaller chapters, it doesn't make sense to use QuickBooks anyways. So it's just something to consider. QuickBooks is really good for non-accounting people. It's kind of designed for that, but there are some pieces of the software that you have to be a QuickBooks accountant user to use, whether you're on desktop or online. And I do have access to those things. So there are things I can do in the software that the students can't do simply because they're not a QuickBooks Online accountant. I am. And those kind of things are like entering certain types of transactions and changes that you really don't need to do on a daily basis. But if you do them and you do them incorrectly, it can create massive nightmares. So because of that, I think you need to have a professional accountant or a bookkeeper guiding the students through the process of implementing QuickBooks. There's also the Treasurer Officer Guide that the National Office puts out, and we have a bunch of stuff linked on the Region H site. And then, there's me. I'm also a resource. And I'll show you on the Region H site where you can find these things. So if you go, here's our homepage, aporegionh.org. And then if you go to resources and then students, and then on the left, on the bottom, there's this finance section. So you can see there's all sorts of different things available to the students. So there's a lot out there. And then this is like a really bad graphic. This is the author guide, which I'll link this in the chat. It's probably a good idea, huh? How do I check? Oh, Rick, I just saw your question in the chat. I am not sure what Xero or Gram is. Are those like tax prep softwares?
Yeah, I think they're similar to, I've never used QuickBooks, but when I was like a region like finance person and I like managed like our region budget of like 75,000, and we used like Xero, I think it was the accounting software, and then Gram was like where we uploaded like pictures of our receipts. I think Gram is specific through Bank of America, I think, but Xero I think is just a general software.
Well, my answer to that, I just Googled both of them. So Xero is probably very similar to QuickBooks Online. That's what it looks like to me. I'm not familiar with it, so I can't really comment on it, to be honest. And then, so Gram, for uploading receipts, like that is something you can do in QuickBooks Online. And QuickBooks Online also has an app that goes along with it, like a smartphone app. And you can scan or like take a picture of your receipt and upload it directly into QuickBooks pretty much wherever you want it to be. So like you can tie it to that expense transaction in QuickBooks. And the mobile app is really good for some like super basic, simple things. There's a lot of things that you can't do just because it's like more complicated than what you really should be doing on a tiny smartphone screen, but you can upload receipts into QuickBooks. So I don't know that Gram would really be like needed unless it was something that like went along with your bank, Yeah. So I sent a link in the chat to the officer guide for treasurers, and this is pretty short and sweet and like to the point, and a lot of the info I put in my like chapter treasurer 101 section of my presentation came out of this. They do have this like chapter budget spreadsheet in here, And I think this is a really good starting point, and it shows like what types of things should be in your budget worksheet. You should have separate income and expenses. Anything that goes on this income sheet should be included in your gross receipts number. So see how like chapter fees, pledge fees, membership dues are included on there. Same thing with fundraising and any school funding you get. Your income and expenses should tie, and if they don't tie, it should be because you have money that you're carrying over to next semester for whatever reason. And if you have a chapter bank account that's your own bank account, you probably will have funds that you're carrying over to next semester. That shouldn't be a very large amount of money. So yeah, this is really good starting point. I don't know that I would use this as the only thing that we use to record the chapter budget. But it is a really good starting point, and it does demonstrate like all of the different things you need to hit with it. So, so that's all I have for today. I was hoping I'd leave a little bit of time for questions. So if anybody has questions, you can just unmute your mic or put them in the chat. And I've also, you can reach me at my email. Oops. So, yeah. Oops.
Okay, so you said every chapter in Ohio should be filling out like that charitable registration annual report, correct?
If they file their own 990. So if they're rolled into their university's 990 form, they should not be, because they're considered a subsidiary of the university or like a division of the university. Whereas if they have their own FEIN, they should be filing that charitable registration.
Okay, gotcha.
Is there any other questions? Doesn't look like we have anything in the chat. All right, well, thanks for joining me. I hope this wasn't too painful. So have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.